Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
It
Morning.
is our second in our Modern Jewish Thinkers series, summer 2026. And it's a great privilege and daunting task, which I won't even scratch the surface of, to share some of the life story and teachings and worldview of Harav Aharon Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, co-Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, also known as Gush, for many decades, and died about 10 years ago. I think very often about what he would think or say or opine about the events of the last 10 years. His voice was such a centrist, moderate, nuanced, complex, and very conversant with the current moment kind of voice. Voices like that, I think, are fewer and further between and harder to find in our world today. Sometimes he was too nuanced and too complex, and you couldn't necessarily tell exactly what he really thought about something. Very often, when it came to halachic questions, he was very reticent to offer an answer if he didn't feel he understood the circumstances or the context. I can think of multiple occasions where people in my life who were direct students of his, recounted asking him a question, and he either didn't want to answer or he said, well, if it's this, then this, and if it's this, then this, and if it's this, then this. And at the end, they weren't really sure what he was saying the answer was. But that was part of the beauty of his persona. And again, we live in a world of oversimplification. So over complexity is a side worth leaning towards more often than not. And I had the privilege of learning in Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush in 1998-99. That was my primary time of exposure to Rav Lichtenstein. I was at that time coming without a tremendous amount of Talmud background, and so it wasn't a year in which I feel I was able to fully appreciate his erudition, his brilliance, or even fully understand his Hebrew, um, which was not just beautiful and sophisticated Hebrew, but he was notorious, and this has been carried forward in one of the current Rosh Yeshiva of Gush Rav Meidan, notorious for just difficult to discern speech. He spoke in a somewhat garbled voice, and so it was the challenge of actually discerning his words, then actually understanding his Hebrew, and then actually parsing the meaning of
Oh,
his
God.
often very complex, sophisticated thoughts. So sort of a triple whammy to understand him. But certainly in the years since, the opportunity to read his writings and to both his writings that were written after 1998, in the years after I was in his yeshiva, but also now looking back to writings that were written before that time. Um, I find his voice so precious and so important for our community. For those who are here, I have some bibliography. These are some of the books that the essays we're going to look at excerpts from come from. These two volumes of Leaves of Faith, The World of Jewish Learning and the World of Jewish Living, which I highly, highly recommend. A volume called By His Light, Character, and Values in the Service of God, an amazing book. Um, a set of essays called Varieties of Jewish Experience by Rav Lichtenstein. And then finally, a series of eulogies that were given and recollections and remembrances of his life that were published posthumously in his memory and in his honor, called A Life Steady and Whole. We may get to the excerpt from the Victorian writer Matthew Arnold, where that phrase "a life steady and whole," which was used in tribute to Rav Lichtenstein, comes from, and we might not get to it. So what I want to try to do is look at a few excerpts of his writing that give us a little window into his thought. I'll share just first a brief biographical overview. We'll look at a few excerpts of his writing that give a little window into his thought, and then his impact on our community is enormous because so many of our own teachers were students of his. I think Rav Avi. Certainly, while Rav Avi probably migrated more to Rav Lichtenstein's co-rosh yeshiva, Rav Amital, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, than to Rav Aharon, he also had a relationship with Rav Aharon. My father-in-law, Rabbi Heshi Billet, and my mother-in-law, Rebbetzin Rookie Billet, were very close to Rav Lichtenstein and spent much time with him and asked him many questions. And I have a set of short vignettes from my father-in-law that he shared with me on the source sheet, which are just worth reading through. They paint a really personal picture of Rav Aharon, which shed light as a complement to Rav Aharon's own writings, and just give a glimpse of the person who lived out the values that he writes about and teaches about. I think if we were, to sort of try to summarize and distill the core of who Rav Lichtenstein was, I called this session Torah, Faith, and Humanism. Rav Lichtenstein at his core was a Talmid Chacham, someone who had a deep and abiding love of Torah, passion for Torah, brilliance in Torah, both, in every dimension of Torah. The story is told about Rav Lichtenstein that when he applied to YU Smicha, he was filling out the application form. And I myself filled out the very same application form years ago. And there's a spot on the application form for Talmuds studied, and then a second one that says Talmuds proficient in. And the idea is you're supposed to write down what tractates of Talmud have you learned and which ones have you particularly mastered. And the story goes that Rav Aharon wrote down on Talmud studied not a list of tractates. He wrote Bavli, Yerushalmi, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. And in Talmud's proficient in, he wrote Bavli. Right? It was his, I'm not an expert in the Jerusalem Talmud, he was saying. I'm only an expert in the Babylonian Talmud, as he was applying to rabbinical school. So this is just a little glimpse of his Torah erudition. It was his passion. He viewed the world through the lens of Torah. Second, he was a paragon, and in this way he continued deeply in the footsteps of his father-in-law, the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, as a proponent of Torah Umada, someone who deeply believed in the relationship between we won't call it synthesis. This is a hotly debated point. We won't call it synthesis of, because for him, Torah was paramount. Mada, science, culture, humanities contributed to and could be viewed through the lens or understood through the lens of Torah, but they were not disciplines on equal footing. Torah Umada didn't mean you hold them side by side. It means you deeply value humanities and secular studies, but they are filtered through the framework of Torah. So Torah Umada was central to him. He was deeply involved in Yeshiva University over many, many years, and when he went to Israel, in its kind of Israel presence over many, many years. He was not someone who was isolated in the Beit Midrash. He saw, famously, it's described that the Beit Midrash in Yeshivat Har Etzion has many, many windows, and this was not just aesthetic, but the philosophy of the Rosh Yeshiva, that the yeshiva, the Beit Midrash, both looked out upon the world and drew the world into its walls. And Gush under Rav Aharon and Rav Aharon's own personality was one that was not divorced from current events. He didn't immerse himself in politics to the degree that Rav Amital did for a period of time, but he spoke about the issues of the day. He wrote about the issues of the day. We'll see one excerpt from that in the source sheet as well. So Torah at the core, Torah Umada, and being in conversation with and in relationship with the world at large, whether the issues affecting the Jewish community as a whole, the issues affecting the modern Orthodox community in particular, and issues affecting the world at large, and a deep sense of humanism, a deep care for all of humankind, and for sort of moral excellence in the realm of all of humanity. Just to come back to the beginnings in Torah, in the Life Steady and Whole, which is primarily reflections on by others on Rav Aharon and his life and his contributions, starts with two autobiographical essays. And he writes a lot, and I actually only came to learn this from this essay. Happy to see my parents are on. Rav Lichtenstein studied in Baltimore a number of times. His family lived in Baltimore when he was little, when they came to America, and he studied there. And he talks about just his earliest memories of Torah learning. And just a few little excerpts. He says, I am fortunate to have two sisters. I am the middle child. Our lives, of course, were disrupted in 1939 by the war. At that time, I lost almost a whole school year because I was ill, and I was left in the hospital in Paris for 6 months, during which time my parents were elsewhere. That in itself was not an easy experience. At the end of the hospitalization, I was just turning 7, and I was reunited with my parents after almost 8 months of separation. We went to a refugee camp. Now, the food there was abominable, for reasons which are understandable, and nobody there got a piece of candy. But I had just turned 7, and I had learned Shmona Esrei by heart, so I got a piece of chocolate. That was a thrill in its own right. And he goes on to say, as for my education, the learning opportunities in the refugee camp were, of course, limited. During all this time, both of my parents learned with me. One of my earliest memories in the States is that I needed to have my tonsils removed. En route to the hospital for the tonsillectomy on the streetcar, my mother brought a chumash and learned with me about Paro going out to the water. My parents communicated the sense not only of the duty to teach one's children, but the sense of joy. I remember that when I was 8 years old, my father sat with me and we learned Parshat Truma. When we finished, he said that now he knew what the world to come is like. Just a few tiny remembrances of his earliest years of learning. And he goes on to talk about what he remembers from the tractates of Talmud that he studied in middle school and on. It's just, extraordinary little glimpses into his childhood. His opinions about everything were highly sought out by his students. And in Yeshivat Har Etzion, from time to time, he would have what we would affectionately call press conferences, where he would just stand up at the front. He would deliver a few words of thoughts about, Torah, current events, and then he would just answer questions. And, while our slice of modern orthodoxy is sort of not into what we call das Torah, that you just do everything the rabbi says. Of course, you follow the halacha that the rabbi teaches, but you don't necessarily follow the rabbi about who to marry or who to vote for or whatever the case may be. But Rav Aharon was someone who everybody wanted to know what he thought about everything. And so people would pepper him with all kinds of questions. And it was so typical. I remember he was always so reticent to give a specific answer because he didn't want people to just do what he said because he said it. I really remember a yeshiva, an American who was there for the year when I was there, asked him something like, how many hours a night should one sleep? And, he said, like, I can't answer that question. Then he went on to say, if one sleeps 4 hours a night, one probably is not well rested enough to have a meaningful and productive life. But if one sleeps more than 8 hours a night, one might come close to not maximizing their time. That was what he said. Take it. And then afterwards, everybody walked out and said, so does that mean we should sleep 6? Because that's in between 4 and 8. It's just like, there's a certain, and that was because every word that came from him was just gold. And you knew it came from this deep love of Torah, this deep connection to goodness and excellence in every way, and his deep care for his students and for his community and for the world. So people really hung on his every word. That's why, as I said at the beginning, I so much wish we could have his perspective and his, vantage point about what's happening in the world today in so many ways. And we can always try to extrapolate from what we understand of what he said about things in the past, but who can ever know? And that's why when we lose Gedolim, we say, Chaval al da'avdin velo mishtakrin. We lament what's lost and cannot be found again, because we don't have a Rav Aharon Lichtenstein today. So that's just a few initial thoughts by way of opening. I'm just going to share my screen, and those who have the source sheets in front of them, just to take a moment about his basic biography. Here you can see he was born in 1933 in Paris, and he died in 2015. Talmudic scholar, Rosh Yeshiva, and Jewish philosopher. In 1940, his family fled Nazi-occupied France and settled in the United States, briefly in Baltimore. There was a little time in Chicago, and then ultimately came to New York when he was in high school. He studied in Masivta Chaim Berlin under Rav Yitzchak Hutner, and Smich at YU under Rav Soloveitchik, who ultimately became his father-in-law. He considered Rav Hutner and Rav Aharon Soloveitchik really to be, and of course the Rav Yosef Soloveitchik, to be his primary teachers and mentors, and he refers to them a lot in his writings. He got a PhD in English literature from Harvard in 1957, so he was only 24 at that time. He married the Rav's daughter in 1960 and served as Rosh Yeshiva at RIETS, the Rabbinical School of Yeshiva University. And in 1971, he made Aliyah to join Rav Yehuda Amital. Rav Amital had already founded Gush and invited Rav Aharon to serve as a co-Rosh Yeshiva with him. And Rav Aharon settled there and remained there for over 40 years. If I remember right, I think he lived in Yerushalayim for a long time and then ultimately moved to Alon Shvut to live where the yeshiva was. It made so he eliminated the commute. He wrote hundreds of essays in English and Hebrew on Talmud, Jewish philosophy, ethics, and culture, and won the Israel Prize, or was awarded the Israel Prize, the highest, honors that can be bestowed upon someone in Israel for scholarship and community leadership in Jewish literature in 2014. He and his wife had a number of children, but two that are notable in our community broadly are Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, his son, who now serves as one of the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and his daughter Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg, who's the head of Migdal Oz, a sister seminary yeshiva to Yeshivat Har Etzion, where a number of Bait grads have gone to study. And Shira learned there for a year and has a relationship with Rabbanit Esti. That's just a little bit of the contours of his life. The first source I want to look at, I have no idea how we're going to do with time. We'll probably just excerpt the best we can and naturally run out of time. But just to get starting off with the flavor of his own words. In Jewish Action magazine of the Orthodox Union, in 1992, there was a kind of a panel of writers that were commenting about faith, about emunah. What is the basis? What are the vehicles to faith in God? And famously, Rav Aharon wrote this essay called "The Source of Faith is Faith Itself." And I find it to be a meditation that I've come back to when I'm struggling with faith, to draw off of the wisdom of my own teacher. And what we see here with Rav Lichtenstein is that he's not, even though his writing is incredibly sophisticated and rich in his use of prose, and it's not something you could just read and understand entirely, right away. Sometimes it requires a second or a third look. But at the same time, he writes in a very humble register and a very honest register. He engages with the real world in a real way, in a way that I think sometimes Rosh Yeshiva don't do, and it's part of what makes him appeal to me so much. So he writes here, this is just some excerpts from the essay. Who prop thou ask'st in these bad days, my mind? Thus opened Matthew Arnold an early sonnet to a friend. I believe that unlike Maimonides, I do not generally experience the days as bad, right? So Matthew Arnold, this Victorian writer, describes, in these bad days, what gives you strength? What props you up in these bad days? And he says, so of course, this is an essay that starts off with a reference to a Victorian writer. Then he brings Torah in and he says, unlike Maimonides, I do not generally experience the days as bad. I mean, I assume this is a reference to Rambam's philosophy of Yeridat HaDorot, the decline of the generations. And so, Maimonides viewed this day as worse than the days, of the past. And Rav Aharon says, I don't see it that way. And this is already just like a little remarkable moment. Rav Aharon says, I disagree with the Rambam. The Rambam sees, these days as bad, the current moment. I don't experience these days as bad. And I'm quite certain that if I did, Arnold's choices, Homer, Epictetus, and Sophocles, would not provide the requisite solace. The sonnet goes on to say that, these greats of times past, are the comfort in bad days. And Rav Lichtenstein saying, I wouldn't turn, as much as I revere these great authors, Homer and others, they're not the ones that would lift me up if I'm going through a troubled time. But as to the formulation of the question, in my case at least, the critical factor is indeed who rather than what. Meaning where I agree with Matthew Arnold, says Rav Lichtenstein, is that the thing that gives me strength in bad days is not a thing, it's a person. It's the who. Right? Matthew Arnold was right to ask who props you up in bad days, not what props you up, right? If we're going through a troubled time, we might turn to a friend and say, what gives you strength? Someone might say, philosophy or, acts of kindness or something like that. And Rav Lichtenstein says, when I'm struggling, it's not about the what, it's about the who, the people that give me strength. Without question, during my formative years and to a lesser extent beyond, the source and bulwark of my commitment was not so much a cluster of abstract factors or arguments as key persons, right? It wasn't an optimism that I believe, from Jewish text and tradition that the world will get better or whatever. It's the people that I look at that give me strength and hope. This may make my response less valuable for readers who have no access to my sources of strength and inspiration, meaning I'm speaking out to the readership of Jewish Action and telling you there's some people that influenced me that give me hope, but you don't have a relationship with them. So I don't know if this will be able to help you or not, but still. Moreover, such a response raises obvious questions about determinism and inequity, which in a different context would need to be addressed philosophically. But any other would be not only partial, but false. So he's sort of saying here, I have to answer my truth. My truth is that it largely comes from people. That means that I can't give you a blanket answer that will work for everybody, but I'm me, and I want to answer for myself. I refer, of course, to those who, in the words of the Mishnah, put me on the path to temporal and eternal life. My parents, Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, who were also my primary in several senses of the term teachers, right? Primary probably meaning first, and primary probably meaning greatest teachers. And my Rebbeim, of whom three, Rav Hutner, the Rav, and Rav Aharon Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, stand out far above the rest. And he goes on to talk about those teachers a little bit. And then he says, what I received from all my mentors at home or in yeshivot was the key to confronting life, particularly modern life, in all its complexity. The recognition that it was not so necessary to have all the answers as to learn to live with the questions. Regardless of what issues, moral, theological, textual, or historical, vexed me, and here he's opening up for us a little portal, there's lots of things that can cause us to struggle with faith. Moral questions, we look out at the world and we see so much injustice, or we see something in the Torah that seems to conflict with our moral essences. Theological, we look at the way we see God in the world and it doesn't seem to comport in a way that strengthens our belief. Textual, we have questions about the texts of our tradition. Or historical, we look at the arc of Jewish history. We're in the 3 weeks now, or in the 9 days now. It's Rosh Chodesh Av, and we look at the arc of history and we say, how can we believe? And when we look at the history of catastrophes of the Jewish people, regardless of what issues vexed me, right? And here, in a sense, I think what he's doing by just these little 4 words is giving us permission also to acknowledge our own struggles in any of these areas. I was confident that they had been raised by masters far sharper and wiser than myself. And if they had remained impregnably steadfast in their commitment, so should and could I. I intuited that, his categorical formulations and imperial certitude notwithstanding, Rav Hutner had surely confronted whatever questions occurred to me. Later, I felt virtually certain the Rav had, so that the depth and intensity of their avodat Hashem was doubly reassuring. Meaning, I looked at my mentors and role models, and I saw that they were also people who questioned the world. And therefore, I figure any question I could come up with, they must have come up with. And they persisted in their faith. And that gave me a reason to persist in my faith. So that's answer number 1. It's the who. It's the people we look to and we say, not people who seem to us to have unquestioning faith, emuna pshuta. There are such people, and they could be inspiring to us also. But Rav Lichtenstein says the people that inspire me are people that I believe question. And in spite of their questioning, or maybe because of their questioning, they persist in their faith. And if they can do that, then I should and I could, meaning I believe that I must, and I believe I have the capability to. The greatest source of faith, however, has been the Ribono Shel Olam himself. And he goes on to sort of talk about, faith in a sense coming from God, and it being reinforced through Jewish history. I'm just going to skip down to the second to last paragraph on the bottom of page 2. At the level of rational demonstration, this is, of course, patently circular, that God is the source of faith in God. I hold no brief for Anselm's ontological proof. This is philosophy, theology, and I recognize the theoretical possibility of self-delusion long before I had ever heard of Feuerbach. Existentially, however, nothing has been more authentic than the encounter with Avinu Malkeinu, the source and ground of all being. Nothing more sustaining, nothing more strengthening, nothing more vivifying. Meaning it's the moments when I feel connected to God that give me faith in God. Encounter, of course, has been varied. What does it mean to encounter God? In part, it has been channeled, primarily through, that should say, Talmud Torah. This is no doubt an aspect of Ma'or Sheba, the light within it, of which Chazal spoke. When the sages talk about the light in Torah, they mean the presence of God that comes out through Torah study, but also through tefillah and the performance of mitzvot, or if you will, by the halachic regimen in its totality, meaning living a life guided by halacha is part of how he feels the presence of God. In part, it has been random. Moments of illumination while getting on a crowded bus or watching children play in a park at twilight, right? This is like language we expect from Heschel, but not necessarily from Rav Lichtenstein. This is Rav Lichtenstein saying, sometimes you just see something beautiful, spiritual, that stirs something within you that makes you feel like there must be God. And then when you're struggling, you can turn back to that moment and lean on that. Obviously, it has also been greatly varied in intensity, right? Sometimes I feel it more strongly, sometimes less. In its totality, however, whatever the form and content, it has been the ultimate basis of spiritual life. This will obviously provide little guidance for those to whom attaining encounter is precisely the problem, right? If you come in and say, I have never felt a connection to God. So Rav Lichtenstein says, it's hard for me to help you because part of my connection to God is reinforced by the fact that I've had a connection to God at moments. If you haven't had that, I recognize that this answer is going to be limited to you. To those struggling to develop faith, one can, however, proffer first the reassuring assertion of the religious significance of the quest per se. As in the footsteps of Avraham Avinu, they have already become Mevakshe Hashem. I mean, you can say to that person, coming in here saying I'm struggling means you're seeking. And that's part of faith, knowing that you think there's something out there you're looking to connect to, even if you haven't felt that connection. That makes you a seeker of God. That's something to go on. Second, the prospective hope of successful resolution, as the Lord is good unto them that yearn for him, to the soul that seeketh him. From Eicha, we're going to read it just in another week or so. And third, the counsel to focus persistently, in terms of Coleridge's familiar distinction, upon faith rather than belief, upon experiential trust, dependence, and submission, more than upon catechetical dogmatics. Intellectual assent is normative, and essential, but at the personal level, it is generally not the key, meaning rational arguments or a sense of we must believe, those things don't usually do it. In the final analysis, the primary human source of faith is faith itself. Just a beautiful meditation from Rav Lichtenstein, and again, in a way in which even at the sophisticated register in which he writes, I think he speaks plainly to people, to their challenges, introduces the personal in a way that's very real. The next excerpt, I think we'll leave aside for now. I'll just make mention of it. It's called, Does Judaism Recognize an Ethic Independent of Halakha? And this is a famous essay of Rav Aharon's where he asks a question that is often discussed in our modern Orthodox community. What happens when it seems like the Torah seems to conflict with our sense of morality? Could such a thing happen? Is there morality that's separate somehow from the Torah? Or is the Torah the source of all morality? And he works through, and as he does in his English written essays, he'll quote sources, but it's not like a sheer. He'll quote a source, discuss it, and move on to another one and offer perspective, and kind of draw out meaning from sources without making it kind of overly pilpulistic or overly detailed analytical. And he works through an argument drawing off of sources, a source from the Gemara and Eruvin that says, even if we didn't have the Torah, we could learn, he says, modesty from the cat, not stealing from the ant, chastity from the dove, etc., etc. And Rav Lichtenstein says, look, right here the Talmud says it. There is such a thing as natural morality. Creatures in the world teach us lessons about how to behave. And so there must be some bedrock of instinctive morality built into the world that's sort of prior to or separate from the Torah. And he sort of acknowledges that. But then he works through the idea that these things also somehow exist inside the Torah. You look in rabbinic literature and you find concepts like lifnim mishurat hadin, within the letter, beyond the letter of the law, or going deeper than the letter of the law. And he says this is, we have, the concept of V'asita hayashar v'hatov, do what is good and just. These are places where the Torah says there are the laws, and then there's a broader moral imperative, which is also part of Torah, even if it's not, what's written in the Shulchan Aruch. And he tries to sort of build an argument around this. And it doesn't come down to one sort of clear answer, but he argues, yes, there are dimensions of morality that are beyond the Torah, but the Torah also somehow stretches out to try to encompass them. It's just an interesting meditation, which, if you have the source sheet, you're welcome to look at. I want to share the next source, which is source 3. This was just an instance of Rav Lichtenstein attempting to balance a lot of different factors, being conversant with the current events and the world, and bringing Torah to bear and ethics and morality to bear in a complex moment. This is called An Open Letter to Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Restoring National Pride and Upright Israeli Stature. And it was published in a religious Zionist periodical, Hatzofeh, on October 15th, 1982. Tzvi, a resident Israeli historian and scholar, would be able to tell us the background and the history of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This was written in the wake of that event, and the broader kind of conflict in Lebanon. And Rav Lichtenstein is addressing this issue. It's a powerful text for military ethics and the impact of military ethics on Israeli society, and one which comes from a place of deep belief and also calls out for consistent introspection and a lack of complacency in the impossible situations in which Israel continually finds itself. So this is just an excerpt from the letter. In the beginning part of the letter, so 6 or 7 pages, and in the beginning of the letter, he speaks in more specific details about Sabra and Shatila and the sort of conflict around it. And then he speaks more broadly. He says, yet, as I said, and by the way, when I read this, I think about the relationship between the Melech and the Navi, the king and the prophet. For those who were here on Sunday night when Rabbi Silber did his book talk on the launching of the English edition of his book on his commentary and analysis on the themes of kingship in the book of Sefer Shmuel, the story of Shmuel, Shaul, and David, and the beginning of the kingship in Israel. He drew out a lot of important themes there about the power, importance, and dangers of kingship, of monarchy, of human power, and the role of checks and balances, and the role of the Navi, the prophet, in kind of holding the king accountable. And while obviously these roles don't map in a simple way one onto another, I sort of feel Rav Lichtenstein is occupying the role of the prophet in, respectfully calling out the prime minister here. He says, yet, as I said, my plea to you isn't only about this episode. My concerns are deeper and broader. In those days, I stood before the Creator and beat my chest, both as an individual and as part of the collective, reciting, for the sin we have sinned before you with a strong hand. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha bechozek yad, right? We say this on the high holidays in the Al Chetz. And here he's talking about what happens when we use force necessary, as he'll go on to say, in many, many instances, and yet inevitably things go wrong. I asked myself, to what should I direct my kavanah, right? When we beat our chest on Yom Kippur in the vidoy, in the confession, and we say, for the sin we have sinned against you with a chozek yad, with the use of force, what should we have in mind? Clearly not to every use of force. Judaism does not preach total pacifism. And this al-chet is akin to those concerning food and drink, business dealings, or speech, for which we do not confess the activities themselves, but the deviations and failures within them, right? In other words, just like when we say in the al-chetz, for the sin of business dealings, for the sin of food and drink, there's nothing sinful about engaging in business or eating and drinking inherently, but sometimes those things can go wrong. So there's nothing inherently problematic about the use of force, but sometimes things can go wrong. But what then? So what is our kavanah when we say the al-chet for the use of force? Generally, I think 2 main themes must be mentioned. First is the obvious. Unjustified violence, attack without cause, is of course the prime example. But we hope that lies outside the scope of our sins, right? We hope we would never attack without cause. but even added force beyond what is warranted falls within that scope. The Torah mentions the prohibition of striking another, specifically in the context of punishing criminals. He shall strike him 40 times, no more. This is in Deuteronomy. Arba'im yakenu v'lo yosif. Lest he strike him an extra blow and your brother be degraded in your eyes, right? When we have the laws of punishing criminals, you have a certain set of lashes you're supposed to give them, and you're not supposed to give a single more than those lashes. And here we're talking about criminals. Why should we care so much? But the Torah is precise and demanding injustice even towards criminals. I think the reason is clear. Even a kind and humane person who would never initiate violence may feel differently when acting as a representative of a system that upholds justice, when carrying out the punishments of a court. Once, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, and the system is in motion, it's easy for the court agent to add a blow or two out of pride or zeal or justice, or simply to round out the number. Right? Halachically, the accepted ruling is that only 39 lashes are administered. Thus, precisely in this context where the danger of overruling and diminishing human dignity is greatest, the Torah warns that exceeding the limit renders the punisher liable. And even more, from a certain perspective, the one who adds lashes becomes morally liable not only for the extra blow, but for all that preceded, because this excess reveals that it wasn't the messenger of the court doing justice, but the natural aggressor, not the sensitive personality reluctantly carrying out society's needs, but the domineering figure eager to subdue his fellow. He goes on to quote some sources in this regard. We'll go down to the top of page 5 and second paragraph. As long as we prefer, now he talks about introspection. As long as we prefer arguing with the entire world over examining ourselves, I walk with a bowed head and a heavy heart. And I think Rav Lichtenstein would be the first to say, as he so often does, rejecting the extremes and coming to the middle. So many of his essays will sort of say, not this side, but something in the middle, right? So I think he would also say the following: as long as we prefer examining ourselves over arguing with the entire world, we're also doing a disservice to ourselves. We both must argue with the entire world in defense of ourselves when we're being wrongly accused. And in equal measure, we must examine our own actions. That's the way to walk upright in the world. All this, as noted, is general. As for applying these ideas to our present situation and actions over recent months, I don't presume to pass judgment. And this is classic Rav Lichtenstein. Each person must decide, confess, and repent according to his conscience. Regarding certain actions, I myself felt the need to confess fully. For example, the bombing I opened with, it was harsh, it was unnecessary. Worse, it caused obvious diplomatic harm, and our responsibility for it is not indirect. It was carried out with our planes, yours and mine. But again, each must do their own accounting. What is intolerable is that no accounting is done at all, etc., etc. And he talks about the need to introspect and look at our own actions. But again, he opens this paragraph by saying, I'm laying out here Torah values, and there are a few applications of them about which I feel confident for myself, but I don't presume to speak for anybody else. And I also recognize that others may apply these same principles in different ways. I'm here to put forward a Torah vision of balance, of the risks of excessive force, etc. People need to, apply and interpret that as they would. I'm not on the ground in the military setting, just the same way that Rav Lichtenstein so often, when asked halachic questions, would say, I don't know the reality of your community, so I can offer you some general principles, and you'll have to figure out how they apply. And he goes on to talk about the need for introspection. And now, towards the second to last paragraph of page 5, he says, violence, beyond being a sin itself, also becomes a tool that spurs other sins. It encourages reliance on force as the preferred solution, fosters illusions of total sovereignty, distorts awareness, connection, and dependence. And finally, a word about our soldiers. One of the most frightening side effects we've experienced recently is the erosion of the IDF's stature, both in terms of its prestige at home and abroad and its internal strength and confidence. This has military consequences and real dangers. Do we truly want an army of square, obedient functionaries lacking initiative, originality, and daring, all of which have for years been the IDF's and Israel's strengths? But again, I focus on the moral dimension. You, like me, know our soldiers. All are beloved, all are pure, all are courageous, and all deserve to be able to fulfill their duty with devotion and self-sacrifice, with as much identification with their mission as possible, at least without pangs of conscience that reach the level of revulsion with their role and commanders. I believe with all my heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't be part of a Hesder yeshiva, right? We have to remember, of Lichtenstein was the Rosh Yeshiva of Gush, a Hesder yeshiva, a yeshiva that combines army service with Torah study. He believed deeply in the pairing of those two things, and in neither one really superseding the other in service to Torah, in service to community, in service to nation. That at times one can serve God even with a strong hand, right? Coming back to what he said at the beginning, we klap al chet for a strong hand, for chozek yad, but we also serve God with a strong hand. But the necessity and the means must be carefully weighed. My students are trained in the Rambam's teaching that a soldier entering war must know and feel he is doing it l'shem yichud kutshabrichu, for the sake of God's unity. As for our overall struggle for Eretz Yisrael, that is certainly true, but even the particulars require deep examination. When I look into the faces of these young men so moved by their sense of mission, I feel a sacred duty, both personal and national, not just to strengthen and uplift them, but to ensure as best as we can that they are truly risking their lives for God's sake, subjectively and objectively, in every place, every day, and every battle. When they are prepared to give their all, let us not give them less. Just a remarkable piece. I'm just plowing on forward, as I often say at the outset and forgot to say this morning. Usually in our classes, we open up for lots of discussion and give and take, but because there's so much I want to impart and want to prioritize Rav Lichtenstein's words, we're just gonna keep on reading. We'll end around 12:05, and happy to take questions offline. So thanks for bearing with a more frontal presentation today. I called this little section Balancing Acts. This is just a little piece that spoke to me so deeply about the humanity of Rav Aharon, and a balance that I struggle with very much, which is called a work-life balance, and even the life-religion balance, so to speak. This was a panel in 2010 in which Rav Aharon and his wife, Rebbetzin Dr. Tova, were interviewed. It may have been at a Gush dinner by a younger student of theirs, asking them questions about their lives and their values. And they were speaking about family and, work-life balance, so to speak. And this is Rav Lichtenstein in his own words, which, were spoken, not written. So it has a little bit even more of a conversational style than his writing style. He says, I'll tell you quite honestly, many, many days when the children were young, we're talking about 4 children born in 4 years and a day, right? They had their kids close together. I very, very often did not daven b'tzibor. I didn't go to shul. I davened at home. I tried to make it to shul by 8:30, by Kriyas HaTorah. But that also, not always. There is a question of priorities. If you have a home with young children, the options are not innumerable. One option is you let the wife do all the work and you take care of your priorities, your personal gratification. You're growing as a lamdan, right, a learner of Torah. You're growing as a Talmid Chacham, your profession, etc. That's one option. The other option is that things just don't get done. And then you hope that the children just somehow develop as you would like them to develop on their own. I know a Rosh Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael and many of the leading Rosh Yeshivas in Europe who adopted that course, right? They focused on themselves there, and they didn't worry about their kids. They didn't give them attention because there were other priorities. Some adopted it not out of conviction, but of despair. It's no secret in the United States of America in the 20s, the 30s, the leading Rabbanim, members of the Agudas HaRabbanim, with long coats, long beards, and the children were not Shomer Shabbos. I'm not sure to talk about that, but even assuming they are Shomer Shabbos, to what extent did you develop their potential and to help them grow and mold as individuals, as Shomrei Torah, right, observers of Torah, as Avodei Torah, servants of the Torah? How much did you contribute to that? Between having the wife do all the work and having a lot of work not being done altogether, right? So one option is you kind of focus on the other things and, assume things will work out with the kids, but that doesn't necessarily work all that well. There's a third option, and that is you, meaning the man, do some of the work. I remember one of my fellow Ramim in the yeshiva here. He was a bit younger than I was, but not very much younger. I told him one evening that I do not sit down to learn for the evening before 9:30 because I'm busy with the children. He nearly dropped. I don't know whether he was surprised that these are my priorities, or whether he was surprised that I only started at 9:30 in the evening and was still able to put together a good shiur. He couldn't imagine. His home was not built that way. To me, as to my wife, She said we're opposites. This is a reference to an earlier thing where his wife was saying, that they disagreed profoundly on certain issues, but they still had a loving marriage. So he says, as she said, we're opposites, but we are not opposites in this issue. This is a very clear sense. Part of it has to do with the background from where we both came, each of us in different homes. But in the Brisker world, that's the Soloveitchik, Volozhin community through which Rav Lichtenstein was trained and joined into. The devotion to children, their growth and development and learning was fundamental. It was not evenly spread. In generation to generation, you had a priority given to one child and not to another child, which is a problem in its own right, meaning sometimes parents prioritized the kid who seemed like they were going to be, the greatest learner, gave them more resources. That might not have been the right thing. But the point is, it was about the kids. The sense that the overwhelming importance of giving to children was there. So I just think there's a beautiful meditation on balance and the importance of focusing on our children that I take as a little comfort when I don't make it to shul, because I'm trying to be home, imparting, educating, and connecting with my kids. Just a little aside as to the comment about how Rav Lichtenstein, said maybe the student was very, very surprised at the capacity to start preparing shir at 9:30 and give a great shir. I was just had a summer get together with cherished friend and mentor Rabbi Binny Krause, the head of school at SAR Academy, and he had himself a wonderful, loving relationship with Rav Aharon, and he told me that he once got a ride with Rav Lichtenstein, either I think into Yerushalayim from Gush Etzion, or I think that was what it was. And he said he asked Rav Aharon, whether he could have a ride, and Rav Aharon said, yes, absolutely, but I have to apologize in advance that I'm going to have to prepare my shir on the ride. So Rabbi Krause was like, well, how do you do that if you're driving? And so he said they chatted for a little while, and then Rav Aharon said, okay, I need to prepare shir. And that just meant you sit quietly while I work everything out in my brain so that I'm ready to teach my class. So that was Rav Lichtenstein. He had the texts in his brain, and he could think while driving well enough to prepare his shir on the way if need be. So just again, a glimpse into his greatness in so many ways. I want to read one more excerpt of his writing, and then I'll share a few of my father-in-law's reminiscences. By way of getting there, though, if you turn to the last page of the handout, page 11, these are the tables of contents of 4 of the books of essays, just to give us like a moment's kind of survey of the kinds of things Rav Lichtenstein wrote about. So there's a lot about learning, why learn Gemara, the end of learning, the ideology of Hesder. There is, his mentors, as he writes about. This is top left, numbers 9, 10, and 11. The Rav in retrospect, a portrait of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. There's a famous story that Rav Lichtenstein's daughter wanted to get her ears pierced, and Rav Lichtenstein wasn't a fan. But he said, you know what? Let's go ask Rav Shlomo Zalman, because he revered Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. They didn't have wasn't a primary mentor, but he very much looked up to him. And they went to Rav Shlomo Zalman, and Rav Shlomo Zalman said something to the effect of, I don't know about earrings, but in our communities, boys get a bris when they are born, and girls get a hole in their ear when they are born, something like that. And Rav Lichtenstein, said, okay, we can rely on Rav Shlomo Zalman, and you can get your ears pierced. So, and that was also characteristic of Rav Lichtenstein to have the humility to say, I may feel one way about this, but you want this. And if I can make your life livable and feel good about it from a halachic perspective, I want to do that. So let's go to the person who we both revere and trust, who may have a perspective on this that could be helpful. In the top right, we have thoughts about Shemitah, conversion in number 8, abortion, a halachic perspective, a rabbinic exchange on Baruch Goldstein's funeral, right? So we have a lot, of current issues of the day. And the bottom left in By His Light, a lot about, a life well lived, trust in God, the challenges of the Holocaust, teshuvah, and what we're about to see a short excerpt from, number 12, centrist orthodoxy, a spiritual accounting. And then in varieties of Jewish experience, on marriage, on philanthropy, on law, on Yirat Shamayim. Number 8, formulating responses in an egalitarian age, diaspora, religious Zionism. These are all, every single one of these, I looked at it and I thought to myself, I didn't read most of these in their time. Some of them I have read, even the ones I've read, I want to go back and read now. There's nothing, these are all still incredibly relevant topics and issues, and Rav Lichtenstein's thoughts are timeless, even though he sometimes will write, in his essays, I wrote such and such 20 years ago, and now I feel differently about it, but the principles are the same. And in fact, in a way, that's what this last excerpt of his own writing that we're going to look at now from that essay called Centrist Orthodoxy of Spiritual Accounting. This is the bottom of page 6 in the source sheet. Here he's talking about secular education and how his views on that have evolved in different ways. So he's, talking about the development of his attitude towards it over time. He says, I'll freely admit that during the intervening years, this is in the middle of the essay, confidence in culture in Arnold's sense, we're back to Matthew Arnold, the study of perfection, has been generally shaken. And this for at least 3 reasons. Meaning, if I believed in secular studies and kind of humanism because I think that has a lot to contribute to the world, well, culture in the broadest sense has changed, and that has forced me to reevaluate my opinions for a number of reasons. One, high culture, the best of what has been thought and said in the world, is less cherished than it once was. Interest in the humanities has waned. If that was true when he wrote this, it's all the more true now, right? Look at universities, humanities departments are getting defunded or losing their funding. The focus is on STEM, science and engineering, and there's less of a care about the humanities. Second, the impact of the Holocaust has had a further eroding effect, perhaps paradoxically so, right? The idea that humanism could lead to the Holocaust in a sense, right? That this was the German high culture and intellectualism could give birth to the Holocaust, makes us question our knee-jerk, or what for Rav Lichtenstein is a knee-jerk, defense or belief in culture and secular liberalism and their studies. Third, as contemporary culture has moved perceptibly away from our own mores, becoming increasingly vulgarized and inundated by permissiveness, hedonism, eroticism, and violence, the need for distancing or possibly insulating ourselves from it, and by extension from secular culture generally, has been felt more keenly, right? And he talks about the fact that, there's much more of all of that licentiousness in our general society that spills into our culture and our humanism than before. Nevertheless, I wish to reiterate emphatically that I continue to subscribe wholeheartedly to the central thesis of that early essay, the affirmation that properly approached and balanced, and the caveats are there is need for much care and much caution. General culture can be a genuinely ennobling and enriching force. And then he goes on to say, not necessarily college. I'm not sure secular college actually achieves that in the ways that I'm talking about. And he has his criticisms of secular college. But at the broadest sense, the study of the liberal arts, humanism, secular culture, if processed right, is still something fundamentally valuable that we should turn to. So again, that's many of us take that for granted, but I actually think Rav Lichtenstein's analysis of it is very deep and important. So just a few thoughts from my father-in-law. He writes, this is source 6, middle of page 8. The way that I knew R.A.L., Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, was as a person with a whole panorama of traits, which coalesced with precise consistency into one man. Though he was multifaceted, there was no uncertainty about his greatness. He was my Rebbe in YU from September 1967 through June 1969, my professor in college and my role model in so many ways for the rest of his life. I will present the Rav Aharon Lichtenstein that I knew and try to paint a portrait of an incredible man. Just skipping around a little bit. Minhag, he writes at the bottom of page 8. My YU graduation class had 200 boys. We were billed $30 for graduation fees, which were to be used for the purchase of, should say, caps and gowns, not downs. I proposed that we not pay the $30, this is my father-in-law speaking, to YU as requested. Instead, I suggested that we open up a separate charity fund. We would each pay the fee to that fund and raise $6,000, right? 200 boys, $30 apiece. Don't put the money towards caps and gowns. Instead, put the money towards a charity fund of $6,000. The class would then vote on 6 different charities to give $1,000 each as a gift from the class of 71. We would all wear dignified black suits and ties to graduation. The student newspaper, The Commentator, criticized the proposal. They were assigned the responsibility of conducting a class vote about the proposal. The result was 98 in favor of the proposal, 38 against the proposal, and 49 undecided. The Commentator then said 98 in favor and 87 not in favor. There was not, in their opinion, a significant enough majority in favor, and therefore they said the proposal was rejected. After graduation, Rav Aharon Lichtenstein approached me and told me that he was very disappointed in my proposal. I was shocked, my beloved teacher and revered role model chastising me for something I thought was a slam dunk. He told me, caps and gowns at graduation are a minhag, a custom, and as Jews we must be very respectful of minhag. Therefore, he felt my proposal was off base and not in the spirit of Jewish tradition. A lesson for life. Ethics on the court. And this is especially appropriate as we just had the All-Star game, and our family's a big baseball fan family, and I thought this was very sweet, these 2 points. One summer in Boston, we were playing basketball after the Rav's shiur. Rav Aharon Lichtenstein was playing with us. This is one of his great qualities. He played basketball with the guys, very down to earth, even though everyone revered him and didn't like to foul him, but he wanted to have that personal relationship. It was a full court game. One of the boys decided not to come back on defense and instead was basket hanging at his offensive end of the court. Rav Aharon chastised him and said, "You are unethical, right? You're not playing as a full part of the team. You're just focused on yourself, trying to get a pass and a basket instead of, going to your team's defensive side." And this vignette, when a high school educator in Chicago asked Rav Aharon Lichtenstein to autograph a baseball for him, this is what he wrote: Aharon Lichtenstein, who strives for stardom in another league. And that's what this, you can see this baseball, a little picture of this baseball. Yes. Aharon Lichtenstein, who strives for greatness in another league. Meaning, sure, I'll sign the baseball, but while I do it, I'll remind you what really matters is not the American League or the National League. It's the Torah League or the Ethics League. Lots of instances here of Rav Aharon's kind of personal piety in the way he treated people and ethics off the court. To his humanism, Nigerian Civil War, bottom of page 9. A civil war raged in Nigeria from 1967 until 1970. The Igbo tribe of Biafra was being ruthlessly annihilated. A rally was announced at the UN in early January 1968. Rav Aharon Lichtenstein told us that as Jews we must attend to protest genocide, but there would be no exemption from Torah study in order to attend the rally. We arose early, prayed Vatikin, that's at sunrise, had a shiur for 2 hours, and then made our way to the UN on a frigid below-zero morning. Of the 60 people who attended the rally, 47 were YU boys with their Rebbe, Rav Aharon Lichtenstein. Goes on to talk about Rav Aharon's role in women's Torah study, in pushing back and responding to sexual abuse in the Orthodox community. The next one, set tall goals. Each year when we began shiur, Rav Aharon would enumerate the number of pages in the Talmud that he expected to cover. There was a bit of snickering because the amount to be covered appeared to be unattainable. He told us that if he suggested 40 pages, maybe we would do 35 pages. But if he said 60 pages, then maybe we would do 50 pages. You must always strive for higher goals to achieve more. And I particularly remember, in this vein, the end of my, the bulk of my year, 98, 99, when I was in Yeshivat Har Etzion, still just coming to learn and understand who Rav Aharon was, but at the end of the Choref Zman, the sort of bulk of the year, right before Pesach, we finished up the year, the main part of the year of learning. We were learning Baba Kama, Tractate Baba Kama at the time. And Rav Lichtenstein, I've mentioned this in a few contexts here at the Bayit, Rav Lichtenstein, in his kind of closing Sicha, he said, we didn't do as well as we should have. We didn't cover as much, ground as we should have, and we didn't learn as deeply as we should have. And then he said, my purpose here is not to make you feel bad. If you feel, depressed or criticized as a result of my words, dismiss them. But if you feel inspired as a result of my words to learn over vacation and make up what we didn't achieve, or to come back after Pesach, energized to go further, go harder, go stronger, then please take my words to heart. And again, it was that, what we saw in the very first excerpt, where he thought about how his words would be received by his listeners, and he wanted them to be effective and meaningful. So he said what he felt, but then he also acknowledged how would you hear it, and he wanted it to be effective or useful. I remember really only one encounter with him directly, other than he used to walk with a lot of books in his arms. He's a big guy, and he would carry 8 or 10 books under each arm like this. And I remember, and he would walk very quickly. And I remember standing near a friend who accidentally bumped into him, and all the books fell down, and Rav Aharon apologized. It was not Rav Aharon's fault, and he picked them up and went on his way. But when my grandfather, my mother's father, died in the fall of that year, I had gone back when he was ailing and went back again after he died to be at home with my family. And when I got back to yeshiva afterwards, I wanted to say Kaddish for my grandfather. And I asked Rav Lichtenstein because he was the Mara de Asra. He's the halachic authority for, for the yeshiva. I knew it wasn't commonplace for a child to say Kaddish for a grandfather. Thank God my parents are living. And I told him, my grandfather died. My parents are living. I had a very close relationship with him, and I would like to say Kaddish for him here in yeshiva. What's your feeling? What's your, and he said, the halacha is straightforward. If you have your parents' permission, you may do so. And so if you do, you're welcome to say Kaddish and honor your grandfather's memory. And I did, receive my parents' permission, and I did say Kaddish for my grandfather. And, in some way, Rav Aharon will always be a part of that for me. There are some people who, for superstitious or, ayin hara, I don't say it in a judgmental way, reasons would say, even if that's the technical halacha, you shouldn't do it. But Rav Aharon, I think he both, was a very straight and narrow about halacha. And also, I think in that humane way, he saw how important and meaningful that request was from me. And he wanted, just like his daughter with the pierced ears, if there's a way to make it possible within the bounds of appropriate halacha and propriety, he wanted to make those things possible. And I have amongst the many debts of gratitude I have to him in a very, very personal way for his granting permission for that Kaddish. I am eternally grateful. It's 12:07. I'm sorry that I can't take questions today, but I really welcome offline or afterwards or at another time, any of your questions or comments. I will, if you do want a copy of the source sheet, I saw Ellen requested it. We'll see if we can figure out a way just to email it out to those who wish to have it. We'll have a few printed copies in the shul flyer bins. For me, it's a deeply personal and meaningful privilege. We only scratched the surface. In preparing for this, I so deeply doubled and quadrupled and exponentially increased a renewed love and appreciation for Rav Aharon and his voice. And if his excerpts here speak to you, books of his writings like the ones I showed here are widely available. And I think he has so much to say to us in the moment in which we're living today. His humanity, his personal ethics, his passion for Torah, are an incredibly high bar to strive for, that whether we achieve it or not is really worth striving for. So thank you for joining for the learning and, and honoring who for me is one of the greatest gedolim of our community and our time in Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day to all. Love to mom and dad. Bye.
Very inspiring.